Welcome to the Hendrickson House, located here outside of the historic Old Swedes burial grounds and location of the Old Swedes church. The Hendrickson House was moved to this site in the late 1950s to save it from destruction. The house was built by Catherine Hendrickson, who was the wife of Andrew Hendrickson, and Catherine built this house after Andrew died. Its original location was in Ridley Township, Pennsylvania, and it was moved here stone by stone to save it from being torn down. At the time that it was moved in 1958, it sat on the grounds of what today is the Boeing helicopter factory. At that point in time, a company called Veritol was merging with Boeing, and Veritol did not want to see this very historic house turned down. A variety of people lived here, and the very first family was the Hendricksons, who you will learn about more later in this video. But stone for stone, this fieldstone house, they had a quarry on their property, was moved here, taken apart, plans were drawn, stones were numbered, and it was moved down here. It was placed in storage for 1 year as funds were raised to put it up. Now, who was raising those funds? Those funds were raised by the Old Swedes Foundation, which now does business as the Old Swedes Historic Site. The foundation was offered the house. They had been looking to build a museum, but they thought saving this house and making a museum from it would be much better to do with their preservation. The leadership for this move was under Louise DuPont, Crown and Shield, and Thomas Francis Byard. As you can see, the house has had additions over time. Over there, on the side, you will see a definite deembarkation, and that addition wasn't added here. It was added actually in 1788. So the house moved here in 1958-59, was in storage for over a year. In 1960 and 61, it opened to fanfare and a lot of individuals visiting it. So please step inside.
Welcome to the Hendrickson House. Today we're going to talk about Andrew Hendrickson's will. One of our documents in our collection is the original will of Andrew Hendrickson, which you see here on the easel. Andrew died in 1722 and is buried in Gloria Dei in Philadelphia. Andrew's first wife was Brigitta Martinson, and he and she had 4 children together: Hendrik, also known as Henry, Jacob, Catherine, and Helena. Now, Brigitta died in 1702. We don't know why she died or how she died. We can assume that possibly she died as in complications from childbirth. Andrew quickly married his neighbor, Catherine, who was 18 years old. Now, by this time, Andrew was a middle-aged man, and this happened a lot. Catherine and Andrew had 6 children: John, Gabriel, Peter, Christina, Maria, and Rebecca. To give you some context of what women's lives were like in the 18th century in the Philadelphia area, we need to look at how women were categorized in documents and the lack of freedom. Firstly, women were categorized as single, married, or widowed. In contrast to men, they were categorized on documents as occupation and by social status in society. Marriage at that time was more an economic venture than for love. Now, most marriages lasted about 10 years because death was right around the corner through accidents, germs, and childbirth. And so when a man lost his wife, records show that he actually married quite quickly and to younger women. He needed someone to take care of his children and to run the home. But women, on the other hand, rarely married or remarried because that's where they had their power. If there was some wealth, they became head of household and they could make decisions. So now let's look at the lack of freedom for women. Under coverture laws, which is another name for property laws that were in existence in the 18th and 19th century, women could not own property. Once they got married, the property was the husband's. If they earned a wage, which Catherine did not, she had wealth and she did not work, but some women outside of the home were seamstresses, glovers, hucksters. They had to give their earnings over to their husband. They could not sue or sign contracts, and in some decades they were not even allowed to be present in the courts. They didn't necessarily have guardianship over their children should the husband die. And if they were to remarry, they left the estate with nothing. So there was very little recourse for women in those days to live the lives that they wanted to live. So now let's look at the will. The will is like any other will. It lays out who gets what in the family. The first thing that captured our attention when we were reading this was that Hendrik, or Henry, the oldest son from the first marriage, got 5 shillings, and that was it. Catherine, who was also from the first marriage, got a horse, and that was it. Only Helena and Jacob were treated differently. Helena got whatever the other children got, which we'll look at in a minute, and Jacob, who we assume had some kind of disability, was allowed to stay on the farm for his whole life and get an allowance. And we'll come back to that more later. John, the eldest son from the second marriage, inherited his father's estate, both real and personal, as was stated in the will. He was to divide the estate equally among his brothers at the time when they became of age. The sisters, however, were not in that. Jacob got this allowance, and it was stated in the will that should he wander from the farm, he was responsible for himself, but should he return to the farm, his allowance would be restored. So that's another indication that he had some sort of disability, and he did live on the farm until he died in his mid-40s. So the treatment of the children from the first marriage leads us to believe that there was some kind of conflict or different relationship between the children of the first marriage and children of the second marriage. But we have to remember that these people were real people living during that time period, and we know even today that families can be complicated. We don't know, we don't have any proof of what that was, but we know something was going on. Now, all the other children from the second marriage and Helena got 2 sets of sheets, a bolster, 2 blankets, horses, sheep, cows, and their calves. Now, you have to remember that there weren't a lot of banks, and they weren't very stable during the early 1700s. Paper money was not trusted. Coins were. And so when you see that they got material goods from the house, that was actually had a lot of value, especially the textiles on the bedding. That was quite a status symbol to have beautiful textiles embroidered on your bedding. We can assume that it was a pretty successful marriage between Andrew and Catherine. In the will, he refers to his wife as my dear wife. He gives her power and authority to run his estate until John becomes of age. Once John becomes of age, he and Catherine will run the estate together. And that is so Peter, who is the youngest, will be taken care of by his mother until he turns 18. So the will has established that Catherine is allowed to be guardian to her children. It also gives her the power to run a very successful farm. So what does Catherine do in 1722 with her power? She builds this grand house, and for 1722, this house was a mansion. So here is a woman who got power, was head of a household, and use that power on her terms. So, we are standing in Catherine's house, not Andrew's house.